interesting how you can write cameras off and then again find them and find that they're not quite what you thought they were. And one of the reasons for writing this camera off was that the images were a bit soft. Now, the camera had a reputation for soft images, but I did go and have a look again at some of the test shots on the DP review site. And if you look at the difference between this camera and say the Olympus Cam Media C8080, there's not a lot of difference. And the only reason I got this camera out was because I was thinking of getting the Cam Media C8080. And pretty much the only difference between the two cameras is the lens is supposedly slightly better. So this particular camera is a very annoying camera to work with. It has a shift button, and some of the controls you can use the control or hit the shift button and use the control, and it does something else. And it's not very intuitive. I don't have much of a memory for these things anymore. I have to look at the manual if I want to find out how to use some of these functions. Now, the other thing that annoys the hell out of me with this camera is that the tiny little screen, it's not so much the size of it. I'll turn it on. It's just the quality of it. It caught me out, you know. It's really interesting because what can happen is if you put this thing on a tripod, you can have the screen at a slight angle. Now, if you have the screen at a slight angle, I don't know if I can show it to you, whether you can actually see that. But if you have it at a slight angle, you can see how much worse. It's very hard to judge the exposure on this thing unless you're looking right at it. And compared to a modern view camera like this one here, it's not possible to really see exactly what you're getting on the screen until you actually take the images out of the camera and have a look at them on the computer. That is a problem. But one of the great things about this camera is you can actually turn this thing around, and now you can take a picture of yourself. Okay, now I hadn't used this feature before. I stuck it on the tripod, and I also hadn't used this camera on a tripod. It's a sort of camera that you sort of think of, maybe this is a handheld camera, you know. And I was able to take a self-portrait for the first time, being able to see where I was exactly in the frame, because normally if I do anything like that, I normally set myself up and then the focus is never right and all the rest of it, and so you can actually do quite a good self-portrait using this camera. And I was absolutely staggered at the quality of the results, the sharpness and everything, and how for this kind of work, for portraiture, how this camera excels, particularly in black and white. Now, I did take some images with it, as I said, which I wasn't happy with. I used it for a trip that I made. I took about 30 images, and I didn't get one picture out of it that I actually liked. And most of them were, a lot of them were compositional errors because I couldn't see exactly what was in the frame. And so when I looked at them on the screen, I got stuff that I wasn't aware that I was getting. Now, it does have a viewfinder that you can look through here. Again, the quality of the image that you're getting through here, it doesn't really help you assess the picture once it's done. You can only just see whether you got what you were aiming for, and you can't really see whether the exposure is 100% correct or not. And so it's better to bracket your shots. Now, after I took this portrait of myself, I thought, wow, I wonder how it compares to some of the other cameras, because what this camera has is it has an 8 megapixel CCD, and I'm not sure, I think it's the Kodak CCD that this one has. I'm not 100% sure on that. And so I had done some tests on some CCD cameras, and I wanted to go over those tests again to make sure I hadn't made a mistake, because the quality I was getting out of this particular camera on the black and white and the tones and the gradations that were really excellent. And so what I did was I did a couple of pictures of the same subject matter, and with the different cameras. I used this camera with the lens, with this lens. This is an Isco Göttingen, which is a really nice lens. I know that this produces a really nice result. So I did some with this, and I did some with this camera. And I'll put some of the results up as we're talking. And I was surprised at just how good a picture this camera actually takes. And I'm now convinced that a lot of the problems that I had with the images that I took that I didn't like was camera shake. Okay. Now, camera shake's a funny thing, because you can think you haven't got camera shake because you can take so many pictures, and you're shooting, most of the pictures I take, I'm shooting in low light situations. In England it can be quite dark, and at the time that I'm taking pictures it can also be, you know, and I'm wanting to use 50 ASA and 100 ASA so I don't get any of the sort of blotchy shadow areas that you can get if you know, stray from the lower ISO settings, which are the only settings that actually use the sensor and don't amplify the actual results. And so to get the full benefit of the sensor, you really need to use these 50 ASA, 100 ASA. This particular camera has a 50 ASA setting, and that's what the pictures are taken with on this camera. I think the Olympus has a 100 ASA setting, that's its lowest setting. So I just thought you'd be interested in this, because camera shake is something for years, my whole life in fact, I refused to use a tripod. You know, I was a Leica M2 man. You know, everything I'm holding shots down to half a second. You know, I'm standing up against a lamp pole. I've got this grip that allows me to hold shots to really low settings. And so I'm used to shooting a 30th of a second, a 15th of a second, 1/8 of a second, a quarter. At a quarter I'm starting to look for a lamp pole. Now, one of the things about a Leica M2 is the sheer weight of the thing, and I do believe that it's possible to hold this kind of camera a lot steadier in the hand when the shutter goes off, and just the movement of your hand just to press the shutter can cause camera shake. And these kind of cameras are less susceptible to this than maybe a modern digital, or depending on the sort of camera that you have, you may have or may not have, you know, it may or may not be susceptible to camera shake, but this one seems to be very susceptible. And so, and it can also be the image stabilisation, you know, I mean, what's going on there? Is that working properly? Is it getting it confused, you know? So I turn the image stabilisation off. I turn it off on here, I turn it off on here. So I've got no image stabilisation on. And all of a sudden, and I put it on a tripod, and all of a sudden I'm getting really tack sharp images out of this camera, which I never got before. And so if you're having problems with this, if you think, because you know, you could think it's the lens, you know, you could think all sorts of things about it, but at the end of the day, the most common problem with blurry, sort of slightly unsharp pictures is camera shake. This is the most likely cause. Okay, I'll take 5. Well, I'm being a good boy because I've only had 1 cup of coffee this morning, and this is a nice cup of hot chocolate. I'm using hot chocolate to limit my coffee intake because I have over my whole life really been a bit of a coffee nut. Being a computer programmer, I used to spend my days writing computer programs in between cups of coffee. You know, it would be like write, and cup of coffee, write, cup of coffee. You could do this when you're younger, not so easy when you're older. Okay, so we talked about camera shake. Now, the other thing that can affect the quality of the image also is the actual exposure. If you're overexposing in the highlight areas, what that can do is that can blow out, like for example, if you look at the word Sony or Olympus in the white and the black, that particular area of the photograph, you'll see that what can happen is if the white lettering is too much overexposed, it can blow out and can make it the sharpness, and can impinge on the sharpness of the image. And so always, if you're taking pictures like these particular images, I show you what are called low-key images, in that everything in the picture is mainly black. You have to really underexpose these images quite a lot to push the black down into the right place on the image. Otherwise, you know, when you're taking the picture, the camera thinks it's looking at a grey scale. Also, it thinks it's looking at something grey. And if the picture isn't grey, if the picture's black, it's going to be like maybe as much as 2 stops out. So it's necessary to bring the picture down, if you like, so that the highlight areas are not so overexposed. And you don't want to bring it too far down. You don't want to trust your histogram a lot, because your histogram, sometimes you need to push those whites slightly into overexposure rather than, you know, otherwise you're going to lose stuff on the dark end. So getting your exposure right, you'll see these pictures that I took are now all the pictures you've just seen, every one of them has been straight out of the camera. There's been no adjustment of contrast, brightness, anything. It's straight out the camera, because I believe that gives the best result. I've tried improving these pictures. It's not possible to improve them any further than what they are, as long as the exposure is absolutely correct. You can't get anything more out of this. The only time that I use a correction in Photoshop, or I don't use Photoshop, I use the Linux equivalent. The only time I do that is if I have a lens which is a little bit soft. And that's the case with the Isco Göttingen. Sometimes I like to beef up the contrast a little bit on the Isco Göttingen. So this picture has been slightly improved on the original. I'll put the original up and I'll put the adjusted version up, and you can see the difference there with the Isco Göttingen. Okay, so making sure that you don't have camera shake, the answer to that is a tripod, always a tripod. And the reason I use a tripod nowadays is because I take a lot of pictures of my artwork, and my artwork is a piece of paper on a background, and if you don't get it tack sharp, you really notice it if you're trying to photograph an artwork. And I used to do it by shooting over and over again. I'd shoot it on the camera, handheld, I'd blow it up and have a look, shoot it, blow it up and have a look, shoot it, until I got one that I thought was tack sharp. And in actual fact I probably didn't get any that were tack sharp. I probably only got one that was nearly tack sharp, because I didn't want to use a tripod. I didn't have a tripod at the time, and it's quite difficult to get the camera exactly in the right position. You get the edges that you want right and so on, because I don't just photograph the artwork. I want to include pieces of the background in it as well, and a composition. And if you're working above it, you need a pretty good tripod that articulates in a good way to get the camera for it to be easy to do on a tripod. It's not easy on a tripod to do this kind of stuff. So using a tripod is an art in itself, and something that you need lots of driving time at the wheels of to get the tripod, so it's sort of second nature. So don't be disconcerted if you struggle with a tripod at first. It may take you years before you get the tripod technique really up to it. Okay, what were we talking about? I think we've said it all. I'm going to leave it at that, and maybe I'll come back for another session or not. I don't know. I'll just put that in the editor and then we'll see.